Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? This is a little bit of a non-conforming speech for what you probably have seen, although I know some of the presenters throughout the 2 days have presented a number of topics around AI, the use of AI, how we as technologists, users of the technologies, are thinking about the use of the technology. So I want to take a little bit of time in the next 20 minutes to give the framework more broadly for how we're seeing this disruptive space of technology, but then specifically, what are some of the ethical considerations as it relates to the use of artificial intelligence, or even more broadly, automation and the impacts that it's going to have to our workforce? And ultimately, how we as practitioners and leaders in organizations need to be thinking about this space to ensure that, ultimately, as the slide says, we're looking at AI and using it for good. So let me set a little bit of context to start. One of the things that I think is really interesting is the pace of change and the disruption that we're going to see in the market around artificial intelligence and a number of different technologies, not just artificial intelligence, but things that are happening in nanotech and biotech, things that are going to be tangentially happening, outside of IA, but also quantum computing, et cetera. But we're really at an interesting point in time and in history from that perspective. If you think about the amount of change that we're going to see in our lifetimes, and it's likely going to play out in the next several years. Historically, this is not new. We've seen industrial revolutions, and this is by many experts being coined as the next industrial revolution, the advent of all of these technologies and the confluence of them coming together. But what's going to happen, I think, and going to be different, is the time and the pace of change and how that plays out. As you see from the slide, this isn't a century to have some of these inventions come to the market and come to impact our lives. It's not decades, but rather it's going to be, in the next decade, we're going to see a lot of these technologies really coming to bear and being really impactful to us as leaders. One of the things that I think is an interesting anecdote, this is my third year at the AI Summit. I was at the first one in San Francisco 3 years ago, and sitting in those 2 days, it was very much what is AI, was a lot of the topics of the conversations. Any of those at the very first one? No? All right, there you go. Welcome. Last year was about, I know what AI is, or at least I think I do, but here's what I'm going to do with it, right? So a lot of the presenters were presenting their roadmap, and for those that have sat in the last 2 days, I think you've seen a lot of, here's actually, especially the last presentation, this is what we're actually doing with it, right? So just in that 3-year period, I think that's a good litmus for what we're going to see in the years to come, specifically in this space. So the other context that I like to set from a foundational perspective is really the concept of the technology landscape here. And the disruption's not going to come from one technology, but as I said earlier, the convergence of a number of technologies that are going to automate work, drive augmentation, and really enhance how we look at experiences and kind of the human condition. So I use this as the framework to think about the technology landscape, because a lot of times when you talk about implementing artificial intelligence, it's not artificial intelligence alone, much like me on the stage with just my brain wouldn't be that interesting because you would just look at a brain. You need the body, the voice, the eyes, the ears that can kind of create the system to be able to do that. And so as a firm, we think about it as a number of integrated technologies, from rules-based automation. So one of the things we hear a lot about today is robotic process automation. You guys are familiar hearing those terms, right? So a couple of you are. Coupled with learning-based technologies, coupled with what we would consider more cognitive or true AI, is really the foundation for how we're seeing automation of work. And this is not something that's happening in an industry or in a job, but really in all of them. And when I have conversations with clients, it's a lot of times the conversation is, well, where is this going to impact my business? Well, where do you have employees, right? Where do you have customers? Everywhere. And that's, I think, one of the challenges when you think about disruptive technology and how we as technologists have addressed that for the last several decades. It's usually been in a point part of a business, front office, back office, or different components, different industries, regulatory changes, et cetera. But this is really going to be far-facing and really have mass impact to how we think about our business. And disrupt, as I said, business models, so how we go to market, how we think about consumers. I think the last, presentation was a great example of that. Very fundamentally changing the experience for how you purchase goods, but also in all of our fundamental organizations. We're spending quite a bit of time and energy as an organization for ourselves looking at some of our back office functions and how we can provide further automation and enhancement and drive employee experience just as much as we're driving customer experience. So with all this disruption, it leads to a lot of opportunity. And I think there's a lot of things that you're going to see, and it's not just automation as the first point addresses. And we tend to call this space broadly intelligent automation, the concept of all of those technologies and how it's going to automate knowledge work. But more importantly, and I think where you're going to see some of the impact is augmentation. At least in the short term, you're not necessarily going to see full automation of a lot of the work that we do, but you're going to see a lot of augmentation. You're going to see using some of the decisioning tools to be able to augment and make all of us better, faster at doing our jobs. So much like, for those that have, a phone or an intelligent device, it's providing you recommendations. I know I travel quite a bit for my job. I'm constantly getting told where I should eat every time I go to a new city as soon as I land. Siri's not as good as telling me how long it takes to get home because I'm in a different city every night, so that somewhat confuses her. But if I do stay in Chicago, I'm from Chicago, on a regular basis, she'll start to tell me it takes this much time to get home. And you're going to see that same kind of augmentation in your working lives. You're going to start seeing assistance around your email, around your basic communications. A lot of the administrative tasks are going to start happening, and that's going to fundamentally make you better at your job, but it's also going to replace some of the people that are supporting you in your job. The second transitional thing or theme on this slide that I want to cover is this concept of we're moving from a paradigm where we build technologies, we being people, that automate work, to we build technologies that build technologies that automate work, right? And I know that's a little existential, so I'll let it soak in, but that's fundamentally what's going to fuel a lot of this change and the growth in this area. Instead of automating work, and a lot of it has been constrained by the business value, right? So how many of you are working for companies where you have to justify the return on investment before you spend any money, right? And if you're not raising your hand, I don't know where you work. So that's historically the paradigm by which we invest in technology. And so as such, we haven't automated a lot of work necessarily because it was cheaper to have someone else doing it. Here came globalization and the global economy. We found cheaper locations to put that work, so that was another decade of where we drove value in our organizations to be able to do that. But what's happening now when the technology is actually going to be building those technologies all predicated on machine learning, you're going to see a multiplicative effect of being able to automate work without that investment. So what normally would have cost you multiples is going to cost you a fraction of the same kind of savings, and it's going to allow you to automate things that you wouldn't have automated before, which is going to further fuel the disruption in this space. And it's all happening, as the last point says, at an exponential pace. So all the technology that we've discussed, all the technology you've heard about in the conference is predicated on big data sets. Access to big data sets, computational power around those data sets, the movement to the cloud. If you look at Moore's law and all the other laws that govern the speed and change, they're getting half the price, twice the speed year over year. So when you start looking at the exponential effect of those technologies, I think it's going to come probably faster than a lot of people are aware as far as what the impact of the technologies are. And frankly, I think the technology will be able to do things faster than we as organizations and society will be able to absorb those. And that's all the disruption, right? So that sets the stage for where I want to go now from what is our responsibility to do this. So with the massive disruption comes what I see as a massive opportunity and or obligation that we have for how we're going to manage that. And this is a great quote. We need to make sure that we're managing AI and the technologies in this space. It's going to be one of the most important things that we do from humanity at this point in where we are. But it also has a lot of risk associated to it if we don't start having those conversations today. So a couple things to set the stage, right? So there's this concept already of automation anxiety, right? So people, you can read about it in literature. Most publications will have "the robots are coming for my jobs." That's a pretty recent tagline, or you see quite a bit. I think this is funny, so let's use the technology to understand the anxiety. If you type into your browser, will machines ... take over jobs, replace doctors, replace humans, take my job. Those are the searches. I did this last week as I prepared the slide together. So I think that obviously is, and again, this is being trained by the questions that people are asking, right? So if you start doing some of the other searches in this space, the machines are even telling us that we have anxiety over what they're going to do for us. So not that they're self-aware, but this is a good point yet, right? We're not singularity yet. But this is a good point to understand how you're talking to your employees about this, how you're talking to your customers about this, how you're talking to those that you work with, that there is a certain level of anxiety in the workplace, in the companies that you work in. How many of you are in a corporation where you're actively exploring or looking at implementing these technologies, right? It's a good chunk of the room. And then the other half, I would assume, if you're not students learning how to do it, are people that actually own the technologies that are trying to convince the people next to you to buy from you. All right, is that the other half of the room? All right, not as much. Good. All right, a couple of you. All right, so this is going to be an important concept to understand some of the anxiety that we have because critically, I think the technology is part of the easier part, and what we've seen in implementing some of these technologies. It's really the change management associated to it. It is the, how am I going to train these systems? How am I going to convince the people that need to train the systems, that know how to do the work today, that, by the way, you're training your replacement, right? And it's not the person that you just hired, it is a technology. So I think there's a lot of discussions to be had from that perspective that organizations are just starting to talk to. But there is good news. I think with all of that hype and fear in the marketplace, this quote just came out, or this study just came out from World Economic Forum. And I think this is something I've thought for quite a bit of time. Yes, jobs are going to be replaced. There are a number of jobs, if you think about all the examples I've given, that are going to be impacted because we're going to be able to automate them in the short term. Estimation here, 75 million. Now, the upside is there's 133 million jobs that we think will be created, right? So there's a net effect of the jobs. The challenge here is the 75 jobs going away, do those people have the skills to do the new 133 million? Probably not. And I think that's where you're going to see some of the disruption in the shorter term. And we as practitioners here need to have some type of responsibility working with educational institutions, with our own organizations, and corporate responsibility on how we're going to bring our organizations through this change to be able to upskill that workforce of 75 million to the new 133 million. The example I always provide, truck drivers are going to be replaced by self-driving cars at some point. From a regulatory perspective, maybe not as practical, but it will fundamentally change that. The last mile, though, will still be delivered by something, likely a drone. Well, who's going to service the drones when they break down? Enter the drone mechanic, right? How many of you know a drone mechanic? You will in the next, there you go. You know a drone pilot. Excellent, there you go. New class of jobs, right? So, but the person driving the truck, are they a good drone mechanic? Maybe not, maybe. Some will, some won't. So I think that's one of the areas that we look at, and I do an entire lecture just on the corporate responsibility, and I look at corporate responsibility as kind of the new wave of green initiatives that organizations need to think about, their own workforce responsibility to their workforce on how they're going to transition, the skills pivot, and manage their talent strategy into the future. The other thing that I think is really important in this space is how do we start looking at our educational institutions? I don't know how many of you have ever presented to a university, gone back to your alma mater and talked about the stuff that you're doing. It scares them because they're, for the most part, educating the same stuff that we were educated on and not educating for the jobs that are going to be here. So I think that's going to be another challenge that we'll see. So let me skip now to another dimension. So I think there's the workforce responsibility, there's the skills pivot, but there's also we as technologists or people that are implementing these technologies have a certain sense of responsibility around a number of different dimensions around the use of AI. And I liken this as a father, much like I have children and I want them to do well in the world, and I would be mortified if they did something that was perceived as wrong or evil. As a parent, I think we all are parents of AI, right? And as such, I think we all feel a sense of responsibility as to how we use this technology for good and how we ensure its use for good. And there's a lot of topics here. I'll hit on a couple of them. I've been trying over the last year to start to memorialize, and I'm doing some research on them on the different categories and how to think about that. I'm going to provide some examples. This is a listing of the few, and I was doing some media work earlier today, and I think one thing I shared is I literally, before I talk, I change this list every time because that's how fast the market's moving. But one of the major concepts you hear a lot about is machine learning bias. right? How many of you have, I think that's been talked about quite a bit. That is something that's very much in the here and now. So how do we ensure that everyone is biased, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but just recognizing the bias. We all have preconceived notions. It's actually what makes us human, is the fact that we have bias. But how do we implement technologies to be able to remove some of the bias? And I've worked with a client where they found a bias in a particular use case where they're like, well, that's not good, because from a society, that bias, what they call the bias, was based upon the data that was provided. So was the data biased? Was the person that trained the algorithm biased? But then, the flip side of that, when I said, well, wait a second, if your perception of what is societal norm and you manipulate the data to the other side of that to be able to address it, you've actually just introduced bias into the system, right? So I think this is going to be a fairly complex discussion for a lot of organizations, maybe not so much on your cosmetic choices like we saw before. That's probably not as much of a concern, but lending decisions, things that are in regulated industries that actually have, and I don't mean to offend people that if they think cosmetics is a really important decision. I don't dye my hair like the gentleman before me. But I think there are going to be a lot of areas that we as practitioners in this space are going to need to look at and understand how we're creating bias and how we manage the bias that we introduce into the algorithms. The other concept that's interesting on here that you hear a lot about is how do you build trust in AI? And I think this is more of a commercial sense in the fact that a lot of organizations, as you start to introduce these, especially directly to your customer, how do you make sure it's trustworthy? How do people, it's somewhat of a black box to them, once the consumer actually starts to feel like there's something awry, that's going to be hard to bring them back. So I think that's going to be important from the beginning to be able to address that. One of the other concepts that I always talk about that's around AI for social good, how do we invest in social charities? And how do we actually use our time? One of the things I've tried to start doing more of is using my knowledge of this space, not just for commercial use, but how do you actually go to nonprofits and start introducing some of these concepts to them? So I think that's another thing where we'll see more and more talking about that. Similarly, another tangential topic is the democratization of AI that kind of fits in this as well. I think that's going to be important and something that we're all going to be discussing in the near future. Given the power and the transformation that I described in artificial intelligence more broadly, we need to ensure as practitioners that doesn't get into the hands of the few, because I think that will create an unbalance either in geopolitical systems or within corporate structures as well. There's a lot of talk about AI and surveillance. I think, I don't have a problem necessarily as I'm walking through the store and you're giving me ads because you know my preference, but at some point, how much of that is too much? There's also the concept of the meaningful control over AI. How are we as practitioners going to make sure, again, we're not there yet, we're more in weak versions of AI versus strong AI, but when we get to that point of singularity, how do we actually make sure that we put the guardrails in place now to drive the structure around that to make sure that we maintain meaningful control? One of the other things I think is really interesting is how is this going to redefine what it means to be human? Especially aesthetics is a great example of that. What is art? Right? So is it art if a computer does it? Or is the appreciation in the fact that another human does it? Do you appreciate music that is composed by Google as much as someone else? Those are things that I think will be an interesting debate happening. Government and legal roles, right? So that's something you're hearing a lot more about in Europe and other areas, talking about the pace of change, how they actually play in there. At some point, what should the government's role be in how we deploy these technologies and what they mean to society? And the last concept is based upon the concept of the social contract. Anybody familiar with Rousseau's social contract? You live in a society, so as a result, you benefit from living in that society, but it also takes away some of your civil liberties. You can't just do whatever you want because you've entered into the social contract. I think all of us will enter into what I call the digital contract, meaning the example on AI and surveillance, you give up some personal liberties and independence around the data, the use of your data, but as a result, you'll actually benefit from that. But I think what will be interesting is how much is too much and who's going to make those decisions. And is it the government making those decisions? Is it as we as practitioners making the decisions? Are there ethics boards that you're going to start seeing in large organizations to be able to guide companies through some of these decisions? I think some of those topics are yet to be seen. And even apart from everyone in the room wanting to do good, there is a major impact to your business if, depending on how you look at this. As I said, this is another realm of corporate responsibility. As I said earlier, people do worry about losing their jobs to automation. And there's also the concept of people want to buy and work with companies that they consider doing social good. So this is something I think that's going to be important even on the economic side, that it will impact your organization if you're perceived to be doing something with these technologies that is not interpreted as a good move. So here's some of the questions that I think we as practitioners that should be answering or asking ourselves in this space as we start thinking about this. So is this going to redefine what it means to be human? Should it? How do we actually have those conversations? What is the goal or the role of governments, regulators, even corporate responsibility in this space? How are we going to enable a workforce for the future? What is our personal responsibility as technology owners in this space? And ultimately, as I said from the beginning, how do we use AI for good? So with that, any questions? I have a minute or two. Awesome. I know it's day two. You have one. Go ahead.
I want you to go back to that idea of creativity, original thought. So you mentioned, would AI be considered in music or art? And I'd like you to kind of talk. What's your thoughts on that?
So the example I give, I live in Chicago, and there's a Seurat painting who's a pixel. He did pixelation, so just intricate, and it is a 12-foot canvas, and so you sit there, and if you walk into it, you see the dots that he did, and the amount of time, and you stand there, and the appreciation is about the complexity and the thought and the genius behind doing that. I know a dot printer could do that now very easily. And to me, the aesthetics or the appreciation is based upon the effort and the human creativity that went into that. The flip side, though, is there's effort and human creativity in the actual creation of the technology that does it. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation. I do think ultimately, though, the painting over the fireplace is likely to be from a person, and that will be appreciated at a higher value or a higher order than something that would be created by a technology. Awesome. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.